In this public hearing of the Joint Standing Committee on Treaties, these are public proceedings, although the committee may agree to have a request heard in camera or may determine that certain evidence should be heard in camera. I remind all witnesses that in giving evidence to the committee, they are protected by parliamentary privilege. It is unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to a committee, and such action may be treated as a contempt of Parliament. It is also a contempt to give false or misleading evidence to a committee. In accordance with the committee's resolution of 29 July 2019, this hearing will be recorded and broadcast on the Parliament's website, and the transcript of proceedings will be published on the Parliament's website. Those appearing today are advised that filming and recording are permitted during the hearing, and I remind members of the media who may be listening of the need to fairly and accurately report the proceedings of the committee. Transcript of today's proceedings may not be available in time to meet the deadline for questions on notice. Therefore, could you please keep track of any questions on notice so that you're able to respond in the time required to ensure that the committee can meet its reporting deadlines. The committee will now take evidence on the proposed Global Convention on the Recognition of Qualifications concerning higher education. And I would ask, first of all, Department of Education, Skills and Employment, could you please, for the purpose of the Hansard, state your full names and the capacities in which you appear before the committee?
I think you're on mute.
Department of Education representatives, I believe you're on mute, so we can't hear you. Secretary, were we able to communicate?
Yeah, we'll try and call them.
Telephone. We'll just pause for a minute until we resolve that issue. Did you hear all the preamble and the various legalities of the introduction? You did? Good. All right. If I could just ask you to state your names and the capacities in which you appear before the committee for the purposes of Hansard.
Certainly. My name is Karen Sandercock. I'm the First Assistant Secretary of International Division for the Department of Education, Skills and Employment. I'm joined this morning by my colleague,
Jane Azarin. I'm the Director of Qualifications Recognition Policy within the Department of Education, Skills and Employment.
And anyone else from your departments appearing today? No?
No, Chair.
That's all right. I think I had a Carrie Kilpin listed here, but that's okay. And Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, could I ask you to state your full name and your capacity for the purposes of Hansard?
Hi, my name is Jennifer Kavanagh. I'm Director in the International Law Branch in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade.
Thank you, Ms. Kavanagh and Ms. Sandercock and Ms. Azarin. Although this committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I'd now invite you, Ms. Sandercock, to give a brief opening statement before we proceed to discussion.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I welcome the opportunity to discuss the merits of Australia becoming a party to the new Global Convention on the Recognition of Qualifications for Higher Education. The Convention is the first international treaty in higher education with global scope. The preliminary draft text was delivered in 2017 by a committee of international experts that Australia chaired, followed by a 2-year intergovernmental consultation period, facilitated by UNESCO headquarters. The Global Convention was subsequently adopted unanimously in 2019 by UNESCO member states. The Global Convention builds on and fully complements the regional qualifications recognition conventions already in operation, including the Tokyo Convention in the Asia Pacific and the Lisbon Recognition Convention in Europe. Australia is a party to both these conventions. Fair and transparent qualifications recognition is a fundamental enabler of student, graduate and skilled worker mobility. Like the regional conventions, the new global convention recognises that we live in an interconnected world where education increasingly transcends international borders. Australia's education sector plays a major role in supporting improved access and participation to quality lifelong learning for students and workers from all over the world. At its core, the Global Convention obligates parties to recognise an individual's overseas qualification for access to higher education in a fair, transparent, timely and non-discriminatory manner based on best practices. In practical terms, this is about fair recognition of higher education qualifications, but also qualifications that provide access to education such as senior secondary school leaving certificates, and in our cross-sectoral system, vocational education and training qualifications. It is a two-way street where the scope of the convention includes both the recognition of Australian qualifications by other parties and the recognition of overseas qualifications in Australia, supporting that two-way mobility. A graduate of the Australian system, whether they be an Australian or international student, should be able to realise the full value of their Australian qualification through a fair assessment, no matter where they go in the world. The Global Convention supports an individual's right for recognition through a framework of international cooperation focused on increasing transparency, information provision, sharing to build trust and facilitate well-informed decisions by the parties. Again, in practical terms, a party would provide information about their education system, including its qualifications and education providers, its quality assurance arrangements and recognition systems to students, to education providers, overseas governments, employers and other organisations who assess overseas qualifications to support well-informed decisions. Australia is already doing all of this to support graduates of the Australian education system abroad and those of overseas education systems in Australia. The Australian Government, through this department, serves as the National Information Centre to provide official information and policy advice as part of Australia's obligations under the regional recognition conventions. The department provides a range of guidance and policy advisory services to recognition decision makers within Australia, and the department also supports international partners with enhancing the quality and transparency of education and recognition systems, particularly in the Asia Pacific. This includes engaging with partners on the development and implementation of national qualifications frameworks or systems. While the Global Convention is similar to regional conventions, there are some important differences. The Global Convention provides a framework for inter-regional cooperation, providing opportunities for Australia to engage with new and emerging country partners to support sustainable growth of our international education sector. That sector delivers significant social, cultural and economic benefits domestically, with a value of $27.5 billion in 2020-2021. The Global Convention also places a spotlight on the future landscape of education. It more explicitly emphasises fair recognition of qualifications achieved through non-traditional modes, such as online learning. The global pandemic has amplified the significance of this, where a rapid worldwide shift to online learning has taken place, enabling teaching and learning to continue in a safe way. One of the key ambitions in the Global Convention is the recognition of transnational qualifications, including existing forms of delivery, such as international joint degrees, offshore and online education, twinning programs, and indeed those that are yet to be developed. This is provided that the quality of these programs can be assured as comparable to traditional forms of learning. The implications of these provisions for Australian universities and other education providers are significant, as the Global Convention can reduce barriers and encourage countries to adopt practices that recognise new and innovative forms of education. Providers will be able to continue to grow and innovate by delivering qualifications to new and emerging markets, diversifying offerings, with reassurance that the Global Convention provides for fair recognition of high-quality transnational education. Another key difference in the Global Convention is that, for the first time, the Global Convention defines substantial difference. This instills a positive and consistent view of recognition and provides a globally shared understanding of what substantial difference means. This will make great progress towards reducing unreasonable, unnecessary and unfair barriers to mobility. In practice, assessors must carefully consider whether the learning would actually prevent the applicant from succeeding in the activity for which recognition is sought. If substantial difference is identified, decision makers must provide sufficient justification and should seek to grant partial recognition where possible. I would like to highlight that the Global Convention will not be prescriptive in how Australia makes decisions about overseas qualifications. The Convention fully respects all Australian laws, regulations and policies so that the competent authorities in Australia, including universities, skilled migration authorities, professional or occupational bodies and employers, maintain their decision-making autonomy on the acceptability of overseas qualifications for student admissions, skilled migration, registration and skilled employment. Australian stakeholders, including education peak bodies, skilled migration assessing authorities, most of whom have dual responsibilities as professional or occupational bodies, and state and territory governments provided positive support for the Global Convention during consultations for the development of a new national strategy for international education, which was launched by the Minister for Education and Youth in November last year. Becoming an early party to the Global Convention will afford Australia the opportunities to strategically shape a global understanding of what is fair and reasonable in the recognition of overseas qualifications. And domestic and international graduates of the Australian education system can be more confident in pursuing further study, as well as work opportunities globally, no matter how or where they study. Chair, we're very happy to take any questions the committee may have.
Thank you so much, Department of Education. Ms Sandercock, thank you. I had a few questions which I might kick off with. I might just ask, does the cameraman mind just muting? Or anytime anyone's turning the papers there, we're getting a huge amount of feedback on my end. So if I could just ask the Secretariat to mute their channel unless we're coming to you, just it'll make the rest of our jobs make it a little easier to hear. I might start off with questions, but obviously other members might have questions too, so I won't go through all of them. This is quite interesting though, Ms Sandercock. So can you just tell me, when was this, when did negotiations commence for this treaty? I imagine it's taken quite some time to conclude.
I'll defer to Ms Azarin for the detail, but this has been a long-standing body of work, Chair. We have been engaged in regional and now the Global Convention for more than a decade, and we are very pleased to see it come to fruition in this draft, in this global text. In terms of the detail, Ms Azarin?
Sure, thank you, Chair. Drafting of the Global Convention commenced in March 2016 with the establishment of a drafting committee comprising of a number of independent experts appointed on a geographical balance basis from all UNESCO regions. And importantly, this committee was chaired by Australia. The committee delivered a preliminary draft text to the UNESCO General Conference in 2017. In 2018, UNESCO received extensive feedback on the preliminary text with over 1,000 written comments from a number of member states and associate members across all regions. UNESCO then brought together more than 200 technical experts and legal experts as well, appointed by more than 120 member states and associate members at the first intergovernmental meeting in December 2018. At the second intergovernmental meeting in March 2019, the final draft text was agreed by 202 experts from, again, more than 120 member states and associate members before the Global Convention was adopted unanimously without opposition at the General Conference in 2019. Australia played a leading role throughout this process. Through our department, Australia was chair of the drafting committee that developed the final draft text of the Global Convention, which was unanimously adopted by UNESCO. Australia was also an active intergovernmental expert during the UNESCO consultation phase between 2017 and 2019.
Thank you, Ms. Azurin. And you mentioned in the introductory remarks that this builds on existing regional conventions. So which are the regional conventions to which Australia is currently a party?
Australia is already has long been a party to a number of regional recognition conventions under UNESCO. Namely the Bangkok Convention operating in the Asia Pacific and its revised version, the Tokyo Convention, which also operates in the Asia Pacific region. We have also ratified the Lisbon Recognition Convention, which primarily operates in the European region. But as Australia is quite a sophisticated player with qualifications recognition, we are invited by the Europeans to also participate in that convention. We've long been a party to those conventions. So I've said the Bangkok, Lisbon, and Tokyo conventions ratified in 1985, 2002, and 2014, respectively.
Mm-hmm. And as I understand it, that this global convention that we're considering today, it effectively means a default of yes, in the sense that your qualification is assumed to be recognised or equivalent unless the competent recognition authority in that country can establish grounds for a substantial difference in standards. Is that right? It's a sort of default yes assumption, if you like?
The Global Convention, like the regional conventions already at play, does take a very positive view of recognition. So as you say, there is an approach to recognise rather not to recognise. So the default is that positive to recognise overseas qualifications and building that will and trust through information provision and sharing, and that framework for international cooperation in a dedicated sense to provide information to inform decisions by those recognition decision makers in country.
Right, okay. So in general terms, this global convention will increase the portability, if you like, of tertiary qualifications, and then I also imagine help establish a more significant global market in higher education then.
That's right, Chair. This is a long-standing agenda to increase the mobility of Australian qualifications and also increase the delivery for Australian education providers. So where they deliver in other countries through traditional or non-traditional forms, to increase the recognition of those qualifications and create new opportunities for cross-border education delivery.
And is this convention open to every state party to become a party to, all 193 UN member states?
That's correct.
It is, Chair.
Okay. So without wishing to be mischievous, obviously, we see this a bit with shipping and flags of convenience, where lightly regulated or poorly regulated states often are the flag state of commercial vessels. What will stop there being a sort of a race to the bottom here? So a country that does not have standards of higher education or tertiary education that we would accept or consider equivalent, at least in Australia, I don't know, turning out medical degrees for argument's sake at a sort of rock bottom rate and flooding the market with it. How will we make sure that standards are not lessened as a result of establishing a universal regime like this?
Well, the Global Convention does not prescribe how to assess an overseas qualification. In Australia's decentralised recognition system, the Global Convention fully respects the autonomy of Australian authorities involved in the recognition of overseas qualification. So universities and other education providers are fully autonomous and responsible for setting the standards and the procedures required to meet those standards for admissions purposes. The skilled migration assessing authorities, which was mentioned, some of whom also wear dual hats for professional bodies in Australia to enter the profession. They are also fully autonomous in the skilled migration decisions that they make and setting those standards. Employers as well, whether they be for skilled employment or for general employment. They are very autonomous with those standards, and in fact the Global Convention, in terms of its provisions for supporting international cooperation, seeks to share and provide information about Australia's education and training system and its qualifications and quality assurance mechanisms to other countries so that they can make well-informed decisions about Australian qualifications. Likewise, if a education institution or skilled migration assessing authority or an employer seeks more information about an overseas qualification, the Global Convention provides that dedicated mechanism to contact another party to get more information about the system so that a very well-informed decision can be made here. But the decision does rest with those competent authorities in Australia.
Building on that, Chair, one of the department's key roles is to facilitate that information flow and decision-making process. The department publishes extensive material on other countries' education systems designed to assist employers, skilled migration authorities and education providers in making those decisions. That is material that is widely available, and that goes into some detail to assist with those decisions and to help appropriate authorities understand other countries' education systems and how they compare to our own.
That being the case, will the department take the lead role in, I guess, communicating to other treaty parties the decisions of Australian authorities and helping them liaise? Because I'm just conscious we don't have a centralised authority in this regard. So if you're another state party to it, it could be a little confusing to navigate. But is your department, will they be the counterpart, if you like, for centralised authorities overseas?
So the regional conventions under UNESCO, under which Australia is already a long party to, has a substantial provision where the department serves as the National Information Centre for recognition and for education. So we already serve as a central point of contact to cooperate with other parties and other countries, including at the organizational level all the way down to the individual level, to provide official information about Australia's education and training system and its qualifications, as well as its recognition system. Under the Global Convention, that same provision has carried across. So the Global Convention really does build on and complement the regional conventions already at play and the ones that Australia has already ratified. So we will continue to serve through this department as the National Information Centre should the Global Convention be ratified.
Okay. Just a few more, maybe two more small questions before I turn to other members. Just in practical terms, what will the Global Convention give us as Australian, if you're an Australian student or you're an Australian education provider, what will the Global Convention provide that isn't currently provided under bilateral or regional arrangements? If you could just give me a couple of concrete examples about how this would benefit either Australians individually or Australian educational institutions.
Yes, indeed. So a concrete example is that an Australian graduate, be it an international or a domestic student, going to a region outside the reach of our current regional conventions, where another party has ratified the convention, will be guaranteed a process to have their qualifications recognised. This gives us entree into discussions with other parties, Chair, to enable that student to have their qualifications recognised. And very importantly, what the Global Convention does differently from regional conventions is to bring transnational education, online or blended learning, within the remit of recognition. This often acts as a barrier to the expansion of delivery of Australian qualifications, whereby online learning or blended or mixed modes of study are not recognised by some other countries. The Global Convention makes concrete progress towards that.
I might add to that as well. Without an overarching global framework for cooperation, it is more challenging to engage countries from other regions to adopt best principles and practices to eliminate barriers to the recognition of Australian qualifications and studies. So these include barriers to recognition of those non-traditional forms of learning, which are already traditional in Australia, including those transnational delivery modes. And those transnational delivery modes are key means of diversifying Australia's international education offerings to support sustainable sector growth.
Okay. Just one last question, if I can. What are the dispute settlement provisions of this treaty? So if, for argument's sake, another country decides that there are substantial differences in the terminology of the convention with Australian qualifications versus their own, and so they will not extend recognition to, say, Australian architecture degrees, for argument's sake, and we disagree with that assessment, what are the recourse avenues available under the treaty if we disagree with the assessment of the competent authority in another country about our own qualifications?
Sure. So Australian qualifications are by and large very well recognised globally. However, there are some problems that come up from time to time. Of course, working through a multilateral organisation such as UNESCO, we work with like-mindeds to cooperate and support other countries to adopt best principles and practices in recognition. With that said, there are a range of reasons why a country or a state party might not recognise an Australian or another country's qualification at face value, for example, an Australian bachelor to their bachelor degree. And that could be for a range of reasons, including they have a very different education and training system, different numbers of qualifications, less rigorous quality assurance mechanisms, or very different approach or philosophy to education. Generally, when those issues arise where we disagree with another country's judgment of an Australian qualification, that's where the Global Convention can kick in to provide that dedicated mechanism for bilateral cooperation. And we can harness other like-minded countries that have a sophisticated and mature view of qualifications recognition to support us in our efforts while maintaining diplomatic relationships. There are no provisions in the Global Convention that explicitly deal with differences of opinion. What the Global Convention tries to do is support information exchange and cooperation in that regard, and build that long-term agenda in cooperation in this particular field.
All right, thank you so much. That was all I had by way of questions initially. I'll pass to some of the other members of the committee. The Deputy Chair, have you got questions you would like to ask?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I've just got a couple of quick questions. Thank you for appearing today. From going through all the submissions, obviously they're very positive submissions around the convention and recommendations to ratify and so on. So I guess my question, the first one really is around the fact that I think you touched on it, alluded to a bit earlier, that we already have competent authorities that assess here in Australia, and there's really just a very smooth transition under the convention to continue doing that. So is there any modelling done on whether there'd be a substantive change as far as the number of incoming students? Would there be an increase, or are we basically doing business as usual with respect to the analysis or assessment of qualifications for incoming? That's the first question. And then just this brain drain question about, and I'm wondering whether there'd been any pushback from less developed nations, that in the sense that some of their best and brightest, now that they might be assessed under this convention, there may be more of those young people or students, frankly, from less developed nations leaving and seeking educational opportunities elsewhere, and that could be an issue for their own tertiary sectors, their own educational institutions, in that a lot of students would be leaving and seeking to study in, say, Western countries like Australia.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. I might kick off there. In terms of questions as to whether we anticipate this will increase study demand for Australia, it is very hard to determine that, and the extent to which students' decisions are driven by their mobility factors is not easy to determine. We certainly anticipate it will be a factor that makes Australian qualifications more attractive to students, whether they're delivered here in Australia or indeed delivered online or in a student's home country. But we don't have anything that would suggest that it will have a direct impact on demand for study. In terms of what that will do to other countries' education systems, again, we don't see this so much as brain drain as increasing two-way mobility opportunities. It can just as easily increase an opportunity for an Australian education provider to deliver in that student's home country as to make it attractive for a student to come to Australia. So we would expect that quite a range of other factors are at play there, Deputy Chair. It is something we will look to with considerable interest, of course, as will other parties to the Global Convention once ratified.
Thank you very much for your answer. I have no further questions, Chair.
Sorry, just coming back online now, Deputy Chair. Have we got any other committee members on the call that would like to ask questions, or is it just you and me now, Deputy Chair? Just us, I think. All right, look, I had a few more questions since there's no others. Could you just give me a sense of the industry feedback, if you like, or the sector and stakeholder feedback? I've seen the submissions. I see they're by and large supportive, but I wouldn't mind just hearing you characterise how the higher education sector views this and what they see as the benefits, and if they see any potential risks in this for our own sector.
Yes, Chair. The feedback has been very positive over the period of the development of the draft text and the consultation since. I'll turn to Mrs. Uren for more detail, but we have engaged extensively with universities, with peak bodies, with state and territory governments, and all have been supportive of this work.
So certainly the stakeholder consultations and communications has been a very important part of the development of the Global Convention for Australia. And consultations have been undertaken from the ministerial level through to the recognition practitioner level, all the way through the development of the Global Convention. So the feedback that, in terms of characterization of the feedback that we've received on the Global Convention, that it has been very, very positive, as has the convention's feedback from the Tokyo Convention that we had last ratified more recently. What it does is brings the Australian education and training system into the world stage as a high quality system, including that the recognition of qualifications is a very integral part of that system in terms of its quality offerings. It also sends very strong signals to the world that we're very inclusive in terms of our education and training system, and that our education and training system is considered to support lifelong learning. So to not just to educate the youth, but also to reskill and upskill as an individual or a graduate makes their way through its their employment journey. That the education and training system here in Australia will recognise overseas qualifications for participation in education and training here, but also to support employment opportunities as well.
Chair, I'd probably add to that. This essentially will bring other parties up to the very high standards which Australia already operates when it comes to qualifications recognition, which is viewed as favourable. You touched on risk, and certainly we see comparatively little risk in this regard. And the one thing that I would point to there is the fact that the Global Convention, once ratified, will still not place obligations on an appropriate authority to recognise a qualification. They are obligated to go through a very rigorous process, but at the end of that process, the decision still rests with the appropriate authority, which is an important risk mitigation.
Yeah, thank you. No, I appreciate that point. What about in terms of the Australian professional bodies? So, I don't know, the Australian Medical Association, the Royal Australian College of Physicians. Often these professional bodies, as you would know, are quite keen to control the number of people that can enter their professions and determine who can practice them. What sort of a role will they play or not in Australian decisions about the recognition of overseas qualifications?
So the Global Convention primarily deals with the recognition of qualifications for the purposes of access to higher education. It, however, also does support graduates seeking employment opportunities. Its principles for fair recognition can apply to professional recognition and the professional bodies that undertake those decisions. Where there is a minimum requirement to meet an Australian standard, an education standard, such as an Australian qualifications framework qualification, such as a bachelor degree, to access employment in that professional field. So Australian professional bodies already assess overseas qualifications amongst a range of other requirements against the Australian benchmark, using the Global Convention's principles of fairness, transparency, timeliness, and non-discrimination. So where more information is required, for example, by that professional body, they can contact another participating country to seek more information, and we can in the department help to facilitate that as well. However, decisions about employment and professional recognition, I just wanted to emphasise, remain at the discretion of that professional body.
All right, thank you very much. I don't think I had any further questions. Deputy Chair, did you have anything else you wish to discuss?
No further questions from me. Thank you, Chair.
Just some procedural ones then, just to finish off. So how many countries have ratified this today? Did I read a figure of about 5 or 6? Is that right?
7?
Yeah, to date, as of this month, 7 countries have ratified the convention, and a couple more are expected to deposit their instruments of ratification early this year.
Okay. And does a certain threshold number of countries need to be met before the treaty enters into force?
Yes, indeed. 20 state parties are required before the convention can enter into force.
Okay. And are there any domestic legislative or regulatory requirements for Australia to meet its treaty obligations should we proceed to ratification of this treaty, or convention rather?
No, Chair. Effectively, we are meeting those obligations already in our current arrangements.
Okay. Okay, so if for argument's sake, the committee did recommend the government proceed to ratification, the government decides to do so, when would we be in a position, roughly speaking, do you think, to deposit our instrument of ratification? Sometime this year, next year?
This year, absolutely.
Okay, all right. So we would probably be one of the earlier countries to deposit our instrument of ratification then.
That's right.
All right, thank you. And I just also noticed that the treaty was concluded in 2019. Remember, is that right? November 2019.
That's right.
Just curious why it's been so long, over 2 years, for it to be tabled in the Parliament. Is there a reason?
You
for that?
broke up a little.
Yeah, I was just asking-
bit with our audio.
Just asking, was there a particular reason why it's taken a little over 2 years for the treaty to be tabled in the Parliament following its conclusion?
Not that we're aware of, Chair. That's a matter of process around consideration of the treaty, other processes of government and the legislative timetable.
Okay, although you did say there's no legislation required here, that's correct, right? Okay.
That's right.
All right. I had no further questions, Deputy Chair, just before we finish off.
Questions from me? Thank you, Chair.
All right, thank you. Well, look, thank you, all representatives. Ms. Kavanagh from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, you didn't wish to say anything or add anything to anything that's been discussed, did you, before we conclude?
No, thank you.
Right. Thank you, Ms. Kavanagh, Ms. Sandercock and Ms. Azurin for your attendance here today. I don't believe you've been asked to provide any additional information, but if I've got that incorrect, would you please, and you have been, would you please forward it to the Secretary within 7 working days? You will be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence when it becomes available, and you will have the opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors then. I now declare this public hearing closed, and I ask you that you disconnect from the video conference, and thank you once more for your attendance here today.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Secretariat.
Thank you.
No worries, thanks.
So we're not on until